Hi, my name's Neil Robinson from LG Electronics, and I'm here today at NAB demonstrating a couple of interesting demos. I'm going to start with this one behind me, which is about HDR down mapping and matching. So what we're showing here is broadcasters have a need to simultaneously create both HDR and SDR content and validate that content at the same time. So initially what I'm showing on the screen is the HDR HLG rendering of that content. This is some content that was kindly donated by BBC for the show. And next I'm going to cut that to the first down mapping approach, which actually came from NBC. So the NBC approach down maps HDR to SDR and is designed for an expected rendering of 203 nits at 2.4 gamma. That's slightly different from the industry standard of 100 nits 2.4 gamma, but the reason that NBC has chosen that is they feel that it's a better match for the type of configuration of TVs in consumer homes, and also, as we'll see later, it's a safe match for the to match the perception between HDR and SDR if you need to do side-by-side monitoring. And I'll talk about that more as I go through this demo. The second rendering is a down mapping from BBC, and this one targets a traditional 100 nits 2.4 gamma rendering for SDR. And as you can see, this isn't quite as bright as the 200 nit rendering, but it does meet with industry standards and matches the luminance that all legacy SDR content would have been created at. Next, I'm going to show a side-by-side rendering, and on the left side we have the NBC LUT, just the same as we had before, and on the right side we have the BBC LUT, which was intended for rendering at 100 nits, followed by a compensation that raises the luminance up to 203 nits to match the luminance of the NBC LUT. So this isn't simply stretching the signal from 100 to 200. There is some compensation here, and this will be standardized. The hope is it would be standardized first in the Ultra HD forum and perhaps in ITU as well. But it's important now to understand why would we want 203 nits, and that's something that comes from an ITU standard where the luminance level for diffuse white would be like a white shirt or a white piece of paper as opposed to a light source, for HDR should be 203 nits as a guide. And so if you're trying to do side-by-side color critical decisions, perhaps for a live broadcast you may have the HDR signal here and the SDR signal here, then it's important that that diffuse white level matches, otherwise the human visual system will be adapting to the brighter image, the HDR image, and your SDR image will look dark and it will be difficult to make color critical decisions. So it's important to have this 203 nit point, and what we're showing here is two ways to achieve that. The first way is directly getting to that point, which is what NBC does. The second way is getting to the 100 nit traditional SDR luminance and then compensating up to 203 from there. We can also go the other way because it's important to be able to get to a 100 nit rendering for international program exchange and to match with the standard for SDR that has been in place for many years. And so we can use a similar compensation to move the NBC 203 nit rendering down to 100 nits. And what you should be able to see, obviously easier to see in person than on camera, but there is slight differences in the highlights and perhaps in the very dark shadows, but for the most part this look is very, very similar between the two approaches. Finally, just to sort of recap, we have a clip here which is a butterfly rendering of 203 nits NBC output on the left and 100 nits BBC output on the right. And this is just to reiterate the point that the two initial down conversion approaches do result in a different output. One is intended for 100 nits, one is intended for 200 nits. And they shouldn't be used without compensation to be rendered at other luminance levels. So the next demo that we're going to show is this one to my left, which takes the concept of the compensation that we were talking about on the first demo, which is we showed in the first demo how to go from 100 to 200 and how to go from 200 to 100. But if you're going to have this compensation approach and the ability to preserve the creative intent at different rendering luminance levels, then can we expand that to different rendering luminance levels, perhaps 150 nits or 250 nits? And can we also use the same approach to preserve the creative intent with different surround luminance levels? So what we're showing here in this setup, we have a larger display behind, and this is simulating the surround. So if you were thinking of a consumer viewing environment, that surround might be the painted wall behind the TV. And on a bright day, the surround would of course be brighter as the sun shines in. And we can change the luminance of the surround for this demo all the way up to 200 nits, which is actually really very bright and much brighter than you would typically see in a domestic environment, down to the 10 nit surround, which is the industry standard for viewing content at 100 nits with a 2.4 gamma. I'm going to change the timeline here so that I can make this demo a little bit more interactive. And when I do that, I'm going to be able to show the difference between a compensated rendering and the rendering that is typically done on many consumer TVs today, and was the established wisdom for how to render a brighter looking signal. So what we're looking at now is the 100 nit 2.4 gamma, the standard, the reference viewing. And what you can see from this image, I'm just going to talk through the image itself. We can see the lights are on in the hotel behind. The lights are on in these columns. The sky, however, is still blue, so even though lights are on, it's not night. And we can see people wearing summer clothes. So we can conclude from this, and subconsciously when you view this content, you're probably doing that anyway, that this is dusk in the summer. A typical bright room viewing that we see on consumer displays is 200 nits 2.2 gamma. So I'm going to change to that now. And I'm not sure how this is going to come out on camera, but it now looks, because the midtones and the shadows have been raised, it now looks like day, except we can still see the lights. And so there's a disconnect between what our eyes are seeing and what we're perceiving to be the scene to be. And so this has fundamentally changed the look of the content, and it's changed the story, and it may even take you out of take you out of the story, because you're not what you're seeing and what you're perceiving is not the same thing. I'm going to go back to the 100 nit rendering, the reference rendering, and this time I'm going to do a compensation, and when I do this compensation, I'm going to, typically what you would do is the viewer would be asked to close their eyes to reset the human visual system state of adaptation, and then open their eyes and see the new image. Obviously, you're viewing this as a video now, and so the demo is not going to be quite as effective. But when I change, what you may have seen in the video is that it certainly got brighter, but if you were here in person, the image would have got brighter, but your visual system would have adapted and dimmed down, and the end result would be an image that looks perceptually identical to the 100 nit rendering, but of course rendered at 200 nits. I'm not going further in the demo today, but the concept can be applied to changing background surround luminance levels and rendering levels. And at a high level, just to explain what that compensation is, it's a change of system gamma, which is an approach that originated with HLG. So it's a bit like HLG's system gamma applied to SDR. And the basic concept is that as you increase the rendering luminance, so from the reference 100 to 200 to 300, you increase the system gamma. And as the surround luminance increases, you decrease the system gamma. It's important to note, though, that the rendering luminance has a far greater impact than the surround luminance. So if you're only going to take account for one thing, the rendering luminance is the more important one to take account for.